Kinmen Islands, where I'm sitting right now, were the final front line of the Chinese Civil War. In 1949, Jiang Zhongzhong, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the KMT, the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalist,
leader of the peoples of Free China,
and 1.3 million supporters fled to Taiwan.
The nationalists are beaten. Jiang's army, carrying the traditional umbrellas of Chinese armies, retreats to Formosa.
After being booted off the mainland by the Mao-led communists, who are in the process of forming what we now know as the People's Republic of China.
Mao arrives in Peking. He has been a revolutionary for 28 years. This is the day he has been preparing for. The war is over. The communists take over China.
However, the KMT kept a rear guard back on this array of islands that went up the coast of mainland China, which they thought that they could use as a foothold to relaunch an invasion and take back the mainland.
Their dream of someday wresting their homeland from the communists.
And among these islands was Kinmen, surrounded on three sides by the PRC, with only 2 kilometers separating it at its nearest point. At that time, nobody thought that the KMT could hold on to Kinmen, but they did. By the mid-1950s, Kinmen was absolutely packed, full of soldiers, artillery, military equipment, as the KMT built an incredible amount of infrastructure on the island: bases, underground tunnels, airfields. At one point, the soldiers outnumbered the locals 2-1. Basically, they turned the place into a giant military compound. By early 1955, in the name of halting the advance of communism,
nowhere are the will and the strength to resist more vital to us than in the Far East, some of which is already heavily scarred by communist aggression.
The United States jumped into the mix, supplying the KMT with military equipment, such as Sidewinder missiles, with Congress authorizing Eisenhower to use U.S. forces if the People's Liberation Army did attack Kinmen, with the use of nuclear weapons very much on the table. This threat was enough to hold the PRC back. And while there was regular, although low-intensity shelling and a few flare-ups over the years, the Chinese Civil War basically simmered down into a Cold War, which lasted for, some could say, is still going on today. Eventually, the Republic of China realized that this charade wasn't really getting them anywhere. They weren't going to launch an attack on the mainland China from Kinmen, at least not anytime soon, and that the People's Liberation Army had become so strong that in the event of the attack, these soldiers they had on Kinmen, well, they wouldn't be very effectual. And there was also the fact that, Taiwan is backed by the military of the United States, and this was really what's holding Beijing in check, and not really these guys that they had on the beaches of Kinmen. So they began calling these soldiers back, and before long, a force of 100,000 soldiers that they had here on Kinmen dwindled down to the couple of thousand that they have here today. And about all that military infrastructure that they built. So you see how these military installations just kind of come like right up to the coast. I mean, basically the entire coastline, the perimeters all the way around Greater Kinmen and Little Kinmen Island were completely militarized. And you just have these beaches that are kind of just like the military bases. Today, they're just here, just being, battered by the waves, just sitting on the beach, descending into ruins. And ruins always tell a story, right? Now this is called an anti-landing stake. And there's these massive, what looked like, railroad ties that were sharpened off at one end that the Taiwanese military, or the Kuomintang, that's who they were at that time, completely covered the beaches of Kinmen with. And the object of these stakes is to prevent ships from mainland China, from the Communist military, the People's Liberation Army, from landing on the shores of Kinmen. And even today, these stakes are still there, even decades after the conflict simmered down. And they just kind of stand at this relic, this reminder, of a previous time, not so long ago, when Xiamen and Kinmen was a war zone. So I'm inside a little bunker now. And soldiers, these things are all over, both Kinmen Islands. There's hundreds and hundreds of them. They're in intersections, they're in the middle of farmers' fields, they're on the beach. They're pretty much everywhere. And soldiers just kind of be posted in them, just kind of like looking out, little holes for, people to shoot. The thing about these bunkers is that, very few of them are just, isolated structures. Usually they're like the way in and way out to tunnels, to the Kinmen tunnel system. And you see, down below, each of them, almost all of them will have, ways to get underground from inside them. And here, this is it right here. And basically, soldiers can climb, down through this hole and access these tunnels that can go to like other military bases, other bunkers, they just kind of dug into the side of the cliffs, like the natural cliffs that look over the beach, and they just kind of dug tunnels through them, like into the ground. So pretty much, the entire military was like living underground, and there's all these tunnels that lead like all over the island. There's like tons of military tunnels, and there's also civilian tunnels as well. Each village has a bunker. Sometimes individual houses have their own bunkers, where they can like go underground and access these tunnels and get like all over the island. More tunnels. So, the ROC military, the Kuomintang, they absolutely packed, Kinmen Island, especially the coastal areas, with landmines. So, every red dot on this map shows where there was, and in some cases still are, minefields. Between like the 1950s and 1980s, the Kuomintang military laid around, something like 70,000 landmines all around the periphery of both Greater and Lesser Kinmen Islands. They completely surrounded the place in this wall of explosive devices. And then, they eventually realized that, hey, these landmines aren't really doing anything. Nobody's really attacking, and they're just kind of, sitting out there, just waiting to blow somebody up. And so they started removing them around 98 or so. And the process is still ongoing today. Apparently there's still landmines out there. Now, what you see behind me is something called the Beishan broadcast wall. It's a giant speaker. It's a giant speaker that the Republic of China, the Kuomintang, would use to blast their propaganda, their slogans, their songs over across this narrow strait of water to people that were living in the People's Republic of China, in Xiamen, communist China. And they would do this for, about 20 years. They would just bombard them, on the other side with their propaganda. Because there's the bloody conflict, the civil war between the PRC and the ROC, of which, Xiamen and Kinmen was the front lines of, it eventually evolved into, a war of propaganda. And this propaganda war eventually descended into absolute absurdity, with things being built like this, Beishan broadcast wall. There was parts on that ladder that was coming loose from the wall, like all the screw. This is what it looked like here. These guys would just sit on the beach, right? Just looking over, staring over at Xiamen, at the People's Liberation Army. Just waiting to be attacked. And I once had a university professor in Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, back in like, 2005, 2006, when I was a student in China. And, when he was in the military, he's a Chinese guy. He served his term in the People's Liberation Army. And he was stationed on Xiamen, right over there. And I didn't know anything about Jinmen then. I didn't know anything really about the Chinese Civil War. I mean, I'm just some kid, studying Chinese, right, for the first time. And he'd tell me the story of when he was stationed on Xiamen. He's just talking, you just sit over there, look through binoculars at, the Kuomintang on Jinmen. Like, what do you mean you just sat there looking at Taiwan? He's like, yeah, we just sat there all day, sitting on the beach, looking through binoculars. And the people on the other side, he said, they were, sitting there on the beach, looking through binoculars at me. So these soldiers kind of just, for years and years, they just sat on the beach, just looking at each other. Soldiers from like the same country, from the same culture, from the same families, who had the same history. We just sit on, both sides of this narrow, watery divide. Enemies, right? Just looking at each other for decades.